Welcome back, everyone, to the 2023 Formula One podcast. It's good to be back here with you folks. I'm Steven.
I'm Caleb.
And I'm Ryan.
And today we've got a lot to talk about. We are going over the most dominant Formula One cars in history due to the fact that we've got a absolute front runner in Red Bull this season. They're crushing everything. They're taking everything. And so we wanted to address what everyone's talking about. Is this the most dominant Formula One season of all time? And there are many different ways to address this question. We got to kind of come up with some sort of definition. How do we define most dominant? And we kind of handpicked three front runners to compete with the RB19. So in no particular order, we've got the W11. Ryan's going to be giving us a little bit of insight into that season of 2020, or was that 2019?
2020.
All right.
Year of COVID.
And then after that, we've got Caleb representing the Ferrari from 2004. And then I'll be representing the 1988 McLaren. So just to give a little bit of backstory, what we're competing against is the RB19. They have not lost a single race. They have won, 10 in a row with Max Verstappen, 2 from Sergio, for a total of, 14 wins. Just absolutely insane. What do you guys think about this RB19?
And 14 races in a row, 100% record so far. Super dominant. I call it the red bulldozer last episode out, because everything in front of it just gets shoved out of the way. There's no competing with it this year.
Nice. I like it.
Yeah, the fact that we're even having an episode comparing it to F1's fastest cars in history just alone shows how dominant it's been. And it's just incredible that we're even comparing it to these cars. As I've done research specifically on the Ferrari, it's like, wow, the RB is this good. Like, seeing the results from that season, it'll be a fun conversation to open up. And also for all you listeners to see and hear your opinions, we'll have a little poll at the bottom of the whatever platform you're listening on, so you can vote on what you think is F1's most dominant car.
So let's get into it. Ryan, give us a little bit of a breakdown of that dominant season by Mercedes.
Yeah, let's get going. So 2020, we all know what happened. Everybody's in Australia getting ready to race. There's so much confusion happening about COVID. Long story short, the season gets cut significantly. They don't get started racing months later, and ends up being a 17 race season, one of the shortest we've had in a long time. And the Mercedes had a very interesting technological innovation that they brought to the 2020 season, and that was their DAS system, the dual axis steering. And the remarkable thing about this is it allowed the drivers to push and pull the steering column to adjust the toe angle of the front tires in order to either preserve the tires, heat them up, to take the corners better, and it allowed them to manage their tires better than anybody else on the grid. And I don't think we can talk about the W11 without talking about that innovation. It was deemed legal that year by the FIA. Next year, they disallowed it, and because all the teams were a little pissed that Mercedes had this. So the Mercedes, just a brief overview, 1,025 horsepower, remarkable amount of power. The Mercedes power unit is probably the most dominant during those years. Weighed in at 745 kilos, which is less than an old Volkswagen Beetle, by the way. So wow. Heavier than the cars that you guys are going to be talking about by quite a bit, but still relatively light compared to other cars you see out there on the road. So long story short, with the 2020 season, Mercedes wins 13 out of 17 of those races. They get 15 poles, 9 fastest laps. They had 12 front row lockouts in qualifying with Lewis and Valtteri, and 5 1-2 finishes. Lewis only finished outside the top 3 on 2 occasions. Once in Austria, he got P4 for he's had a couple collisions with Albon, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
He tipped Albon into a spin, got a penalty, dropped from P2 to P4. And then in Monza, Lewis was winning the race, so it very easily could have been 14 out of 17 races won, but he ended up pitting during a safety car when the safety or the pit lane was closed. So He got
Whoops.
penalized. Yeah. 10-second stop go penalty. Pretty big penalty. And that dropped him from P1 to P7. So the only time in the whole season where the Mercedes was outpaced was in Abu Dhabi, the last race of the year, where Max Verstappen got pole position and won from pole. And in a way,
Tends to do that at Abu Dhabi, doesn't he? Defies the odds and wins.
Too soon, Steven.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that season, but pretty remarkable season for Mercedes. But that win in Abu Dhabi, I think, marked the end of an era and the dawning of a new one. And I do think that Red Bull and their strength that we see today is partially due to the fire, the furnace of Mercedes that has allowed Red Bull to really strengthen themselves and to forge the powerful cars that we've seen these last couple of years.
You brought up a couple of really sweet points there, Ryan. The fact that they had 12 complete front row lockouts just from qualifying alone of the 17 available races. The fact that, there was only one circuit that they were outpaced on merit alone. That's remarkable. Pretty remarkable. There was a lot of things to do with the engine that gave Mercedes a pretty big advantage during this era, and the DAS system that you brought up. I've heard that the FIA disallowed it because those front runner teams would have had time to develop it and create it and adapt it for their cars, but the back markers just didn't have enough money to spend to develop that technology, and so you would have seen Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes all with it, but those lesser capable teams, if you will, without it, and that would have been just a huge insurmountable lead, right?
That makes sense. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, but that definitely makes sense. Really interesting system. I think we should do an episode sometime of different innovative things that teams have done over the years. I think that'd be pretty fun.
We always talk about like active suspension, and DRS is in a sense active drag reduction, right? So it's interesting to see an active steering adjustment mid lap. That's crazy.
Yeah, it was genius. It was pure genius.
Yeah, I remember watching Drive to Survive, and there's a little clip of Toto Wolff and Christian Horner, and Christian's like, we're gonna challenge you with the FIA on this, and he goes, yeah, I know, but he's like, it's cool, isn't it? It's a really cool innovation, isn't it? And Christian's like, yeah, shut up. But wow, that would have been, I think the FIA, Steven, that's an interesting point. That makes sense as to why they banned the DAS system. And I wonder if they also just didn't want Formula One to kind of steer into that direction of all these random tidbit, things that they can calibrate on the Formula One car. Wheels moving and flapping and turns it into an airplane or something. Might as well just take off and fly.
All right, so that's a pretty good representation for the Mercedes. That's the W11 looking pretty good, very dominant. Known for a lot of people as being the best ever created Formula One car. So that's going to be tough to beat. But Caleb, what do you got?
So I've the car that I did research on was the Ferrari, the F2004, and this car is most notably seen and pictured with Michael Schumacher. It was the car that he won his final drivers' championship with, and Ferrari won a constructors championship with it as well. The two drivers that drove it that year were Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello. But this was the end of the era of the Ferrari, Michael Schumacher just winning everything, kind of similarly to that Mercedes. That was the end of the era for that. So the Ferrari, just some quick stats on it. It had in qualifying, it had 900 to 920 horsepower. In race spec, it had 865 horsepower. The car itself, there were 18 races that season, and it finished first in 15 of them. And Michael Schumacher won 13 of those 15 races, whereas his teammate won 2 of them. And one of the most notable things about this car is its reliability. having only retired from 2 races. And I'd like to bring up an interesting point. Um, Michael Schumacher, first place, first 5 races of the season, had a DNF, retired, and then proceeded to win the next 7 races. And so he won 12 in a row if you take out that DNF, which is, I mean, I don't know exactly what happened that race. I should have done some more research, but this car was really dominant, and I have a little blurb right here as to why this car was so dominant. So this is from Reddit. I saw this post and I thought it was pretty good. So it kind of explains technically why it's a good car too. So there are so many records from 2004, and it's not because the F 2004 was dominant. The cars from that era also had some advantages compared to cars nowadays. So until 2017, so first was the technical regulations as to why this car was so dominant, and the cars from this era are still, cars right now are having a hard time beating their lap records. So until 2017, these cars were pretty much the fastest car Formula One had ever produced. So from like 2017 to 2020, they had finally pumped out some faster cars, and it wasn't even a question. And it's because they had these V10 engines in them, and it was pretty much the second to last year that they had V10 engines. And so they had pretty much 1,000 horsepower. And then in 2006, the V8s were introduced, and that dropped to about 750 horsepower. And so this Ferrari in 2004 had I'm sure all you Formula One fans know the sound of the V10 engine. Ryan, you talk about how much you love the sound of the V10 engines. They're just so much louder. Yeah. So much louder than yeah. Oh, it's just a beautiful noise. So they had the V10 engines, but also the tires that were manufactured back in the day. It wasn't just Pirelli that was manufacturing these thick tires. That the FIA actually tells Pirelli, hey, we don't necessarily want these tires to be fast. We want them to be safe. And so that's kind of what Pirelli had. Back in the day, though, they were trying to just create the fastest tire. And during races, it was during the refueling era. You could refuel in the middle of the race. And so these cars were pumping down qualifying laps several times throughout the race, and then would refuel, pump out qualifying laps.
Right.
So these cars, the technical regulations and sporting regulations were just a little bit different in that era. But the Ferrari was more dominant compared to the other cars in that era because they had a perfect engine chassis balance is kind of the reason why the car was just balanced so beautifully, and it was able to they were able to extract so much from it.
Nice. That's good representation. Even with that, even if you include the DNF in the 6th race of the season, to win 12 of 13, that's remarkable.
Yeah. Poor teammate though, not having won at all before Michael won 12.
Yeah, Rubens was kind of the Bottas or Sergio well before.
Yeah.
It's interesting that both of you are talking about cars that are dominated in the hands of just one driver. You still have a teammate in Formula One. That's your first job, is to beat your teammate. And interesting that the amount of wins accrued by one driver, but not both, right?
Well, that's about to change, isn't it?
It is, because the last car on our docket is the 1988 MP4/4 by McLaren. This was driven by Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. So unlike your examples, this was very much a title fight between two. I think this was actually Senna's first world championship that he will eventually win. But the fact that you've got a total of 8 championships within one car is pretty remarkable. So just to give a little backstory on the 1988, this was a 1.5 liter engine. It's a V6 turbo. So more similar to the W11 than the F2004, much smaller. However, boy, this thing was not a hybrid, so it could churn and burn for sure. In terms of, I'm not going to get too technical with the car itself, but I want to discuss a lot of the advantage and the discrepancy between this car and the next closest car on the grid. So in average qualifying, Senna was at 1.25, Prost was at 2.5, and the next closest was 4.7 with Berger.
Is that average qualifying position?
Yes.
Got it.
So Senna secured 13 poles of the 16 available.
Wow.
And 2 of the other remaining went to Prost. Another one went to Berger on, I think it was Silverstone that year, the GP Grand Prix.
Yep.
So right off the bat, we'll kind of go over some blips of that season. Round 1, Senna disqualified for jumping into the spare car, which we don't hear about at all anymore.
What?
They had spare cars. Caleb, do you know anything about spare cars?
No, so they would just say, "Hey, this one's not working. Let's jump in another one." What went on there?
Exactly. They were at one point in Formula One. If you had a DNF or your car had a mechanical failure, you could jump into the spare car and just drive that one instead.
Yeah.
So why did he get disqualified for jumping into the spare?
It was procedural. So I don't know the exact details behind when to employ or deploy that spare car, but it was done under incorrect conditions. So
okay,
he was going to DNF anyway, but instead just gets disqualified. No big deal. Round 2. So Prost goes down to win round 1 by 10 seconds. Round 2, there was a 3-second gap in qualifying.
Wow.
3-second gap in qualifying.
To the next best car?
To the next best car.
Wow.
Both Senna and Prost had a 3-second gap. That's nuts. In the race, they went on to lap the entire field, and both drivers proceeded to throw down laps in the race that were faster than any other qualifying laps, period.
Wow.
It's an absolute
race pace was
amount
faster than qualifying pace.
Yep.
Oh my goodness.
Round 3. Senna gets pole, 1.4 seconds faster than Prost. And then he was already 1.2 seconds faster than Berger on 3rd place. In the race, there was a 50-second gap. 50-second, 5-0. And just an absolute insane gap. And this was in Monaco, where, Ryan, do you know what happened in Monaco in 1988? You're a historian of the game.
In 88, is that when Senna was leading with that 50-second gap? His team told him, "Hey man, slow down, bring it home," and he binned it into the wall.
That is correct.
Okay.
So to give further context, he had a 50-second gap. He was going for fastest lap, to which his engineer came on the comms and said, "Cool it," said, "Chill." And Ayrton listened. He had dominated the entire weekend, started pole position with that 1.4 second gap. And at Monaco, we know the margins are razor thin, right? Max got an impressive, 0.01 or something like that over Alonso this past year.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been 0.1. I don't remember exactly, but it was a remarkable gap, even at a 1/10 of a second. So to bin it after dominating your teammate that much, felt for Senna.
Oof.
Yeah.
So Prost ends up winning. This was also famous for Senna disappearing and not returning to the pits. He lived in Monaco. It was believed that he just went home. Yeah.
That's so funny.
Another couple interesting tidbits in Canada that year. Senna wins by 5 seconds over Prost, who was 46 seconds faster than the next one. Again, everyone lapped in race number 6. Senna was 40 seconds ahead of Prost, who then also lapped the entire field. Just a remarkable amount of these stats throughout the whole year. We get to Monza. Monza was just the past weekend we raced at. Prost had an engine failure on lap 35. At that time, Senna had a 30-second gap to Berger. And this was obviously in Monza. Everyone's rooting for Ferraris. They were 3 and 4 at the time, and the Tifosi just exploded. With 16 laps left, everyone was cheering. They want their cars just went to 2 and 3 instead of 3, 4. As Senna is preparing to pass a back marker, that back marker slid on the marbles, because as you're passing someone, you got to scoot over. That driver turned in, crashed out Senna, broke his suspension, beached him on a curb, and they proceed to win. Ferrari does. This was the only race that they didn't win that entire year. So they won 15 of 16 races. They had 12 1-2s of the 16 available, and that's including 5 DNFs.
Wow.
So I'm going to say this has got me in the window thinking this is a more dominant car than our RB19 as it stands. But boy, it would be pretty difficult to argue if the RB19 does, in fact, win all of the races. What do you guys think after hearing about the other cars?
Well, yeah. RB9 is currently sitting at 100% wins or a win ratio this season. The MP4 was 94%. Was its that's just crazy. Yeah. The Ferrari was 83% wins and the Mercedes 76%. So I don't think the W11 is even competing in the top 3 right now. I think the RB19 definitely has the potential to dethrone the McLaren on the rate they're going.
I am with you, Steven. I think the McLaren, as of right now, most dominant car in Formula One history. Those gaps that you described, disgusting, and they probably should have won every single race that year if it wasn't for just a mistake. And that's what we've been saying all season. Even though Max Verstappen's been perfect, he's got to have some kind of reliability issue that pops up, and that's the only problem that the McLaren had in that one race in Monza. That's so almost unfortunate for them just to have that slight blemish on their record. But I do think you have to put things into context. Of course, I wasn't even alive back in 1988. Wasn't even thought about. But I think there's just a lot more competition nowadays in terms of mid-season development that goes on compared to back in the day. And so these teams, we heard that the Haas is gonna, I think, roll out in the Austin GP pretty much an RB replica. That's what they said. They're just gonna copy it. You got teams that can do that nowadays, and the Red Bull's still hanging on. So if Max continues his form and Red Bull win out, I don't know. They're on the same tier, at least for me. But as of right now, Red Bull's with the Ferrari, 2-3 most dominant car all time.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree. I think if you look at Red Bull's trajectory right now, they are certainly trending in the right way. Mm-hmm. They have not dropped a single race, and with 8 remaining, they've got a bigger lift to finish. There are more races with 22 this year than the 16 in 1988 or the 17 for the W11. There's a lot of unknowns still with people bringing upgrade packages. We believe that most people have moved on to next year, but who knows? Maybe McLaren throws in another one, Ferrari throws in another one, and they try to steal pole at Singapore. And, it's really difficult to pass there. Who knows? Max might have a lapse in judgment like Senna did. The thing with these most dominant seasons is that there has to be this marriage between a dominant driver and a dominant car. And right now, this RB19 feels more like the F2004 and the W11 seasons, where one driver is taking the lion's share of the points. But boy, that 1988, those gaps, 3-second gap in qualifying, what do you do with that?
That's ridiculous. And that brings up kind of what you talked about earlier, Steven, is that how do we define dominance? What makes a car or a team dominant? Is it simply about stats, win percentages, pole positions, or is it that gap and lapping the whole field throughout the race? 3 seconds in qualifying is insane. I don't even think we've seen the 3-second gap from P1 to P20 this year. Like, the competition is really caught up. These teams have such amazing resources. The technology is advanced. It's like trying to compare the greats in basketball from, it's hard to do it across such gaps of time, and so much has changed. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, stats versus outright performance compared to the rest of the field.
I think that's what makes this discussion so involved and interesting is that there is this eye test that you have to put this car through, and you see it across other sports too. Whenever you compare across generations, the stats get kind of muddled and you're not really comparing apples to apples anymore. So you have to kind of get this subjectivity involved, and you see a dominance like a Senna or a Michael or Lewis, and you're like, man, that guy's just killing everybody, and especially his teammates. But are they able to do it? The longevity, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's
What
an
do you think, Caleb?
interesting debate for sure. I just love that the 1988 had two drivers that were on similar levels. I mean, those gaps that you described for some of those races, it may have seemed like Senna was on a different tier than Prost. And Prost is a champion, and he's won two, right? By himself?
Four.
Four.
Or yeah.
He's a 4-time. Yeah.
And Senna probably would have won more if he didn't have his accident, right? It was a few seasons later, or was it the next season?
It's 94.
94.
94. Yeah. Man, that's so unfortunate. But I think, like you said, Stephen, I really love that point that you brought up. It's a marriage between a driver and a car that makes these seasons so dominant. When you think of Formula One, you think of that McLaren, the Marlboro all over the car, the red and white. You think of the Ferrari, Michael Schumacher's Ferrari. You think of recently Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes. And then currently you think of Max Verstappen and Red Bull. And so they have all done so much for the sport. And even though a lot of people are saying it's a little boring watching Max win every single race, I think it actually is good for the sport. The rest of the field needs to catch up, and it's putting a face in a car on top of F1. When people think of Formula One right now, it's starting to be Max Verstappen and Red Bull. So it's just such a beautiful thing that we're being able to witness a driver extract everything out of a car. I just absolutely love it. And this is such a fun discussion for me.
One of the things that I've thought about while doing some of this research is you hear a lot about people complaining that this is such a boring snooze fest. We've got multiple people, other teams even winning pole position this year. I know Max has got 8 of the 12 poles for this year, or 8 of the 14.
Mm-hmm.
Sergio's got a couple. Ferrari's grabbed a couple. There's food to be had on the table, and other teams just need to pull up their chair and pull out their forks and start digging in. But if you looked at 1988, there was just nothing out there.
There was no
nothing.
food.
It was just who's going to get third place. And in many ways, we can thank Sergio for making it a little bit more interesting with his qualifying woes and carving up through the field and seeing other cars at a disadvantage, give him some good racing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Well, are there any final points that either of you would like to bring up?
Boy, if they win all of them, I think I'm gonna have to give it to the Red Bulls, just because they were able to get it done. In 1988, that car was definitely the fastest and probably the biggest gap, in my opinion, to the next fastest car. But Senna crashed out in Monaco with a 50-second gap.
Mm-hmm.
And Max is just not making mistakes, and that needs to be rewarded.
Yeah, you don't need to win by 50 seconds. You just need to win. You just need to cross the line first. And whatever most efficient way that is, I don't think it makes sense for it. I think Max could be pulling out leads, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I guess we've seen so many times that he'll either start in the lead and maintain that, or he'll work his way up, make a couple passes, and then set the cruise control and just bring it home. Point in case is when he passed the Ferraris at Monza and then was gapping them by a second a lap. That's pretty substantial. So I think Red Bull's been very smart. There's no need to push the car. After all, they only have 3 power units available all season long, where back in the day, you could bring a new, fresh engine to every race if you wanted.
Yep.
Now we have these regulations, and Red Bull's doing a phenomenal job all the way around, from pit to the guys on the timing screens. the race engineers, everybody's just doing a fantastic job.
I will say one more thing real quick is that this car is probably the most tested of the four that we've talked about today in terms of the amount of talent and not just in the teams themselves, but the drivers. You've got Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, Charles Leclerc. These guys are amazing drivers, and so you can expect them to completely maximize what they're given. And Red Bull is withstanding everything everyone's thrown at them.
That's true. There's a lot more money into the sport nowadays, and there's a lot more high stakes in the sport as well. And so they're wanting to. There, I think we've talked about this outside the podcast. There are 5 or 6 world championship level drivers on the grid right now that we have kind of agreed on. So there's a lot of talent, but I think the car, like you said, Steven, I agree that the car's been tested in that sense, but I don't think Max in the car has been tested in terms of race pace.
We've really only seen like 2 or 3 races where they're gunning for each other, right?
Yeah, only like 2 or 3 in, like we said, like we saw in Monza, once Max got past that Ferrari, boom, huge gap. I wonder if Max had maybe some of the Ayrton Senna mentality and just threw down lap after lap. I wonder how big of a gap we'd be having if we'd be seeing the same thing as the MP4. I think Red Bull's maybe hiding their cards a little bit, even showing, I think they are even more dominant than we give them credit for. Maybe not in qualifying, but in terms of race pace, I think they're more dominant than they've shown. So we'll see. I hope they get pushed.
So if we take a snapshot right now, we've got eight races left where we've completed 14 of the 22 on the calendar. Where does RB19 slot as of right now? Ryan, you first.
In terms of number of wins, or
Ranking these 4 cars, if previous to this year we had the 3 most dominant was the MP44, the Ferrari, and the Mercedes. Which one? Where does it slot in for you?
It's going to have a hard time beating the stats of the MP4. I think in this sport, you never know what's going to happen. Somebody can come crashing you out, technical failure, rainy conditions. I'm excited to see what they do with it. If they run away with it, I'll be amazed. But statistically, something's bound to happen and not roll out in Red Bull's favor.
Yeah, you got
a point. I could see them slotting in second as the second most dominant car of all time. But hey, I'd like to see them get first.
So, Steven, you're asking like where we think they'll finish in the all-time, or where, if the season ended right now, like
where are they at right now without knowing what's going to happen?
Oh,
Ryan brings up. Well, you brought up an interesting point where if you project where they're going for the rest, is that good enough to be the most dominant? I think we kind of all agree yes, because they're the first ones to win all of them, right? But with that uncertainty, they've still got plenty of opportunities to have a reliability issue or Russell tussle, as we call it.
I was forecast
for a podium.
So where do you guys think it slots right now? I think right now they're the number 2 with eight races left.
You think number 2 behind the McLaren?
Yeah.
Interesting. So stats don't weigh as heavily for you. It's more the dominant performance of the car. And I think I'd probably agree with you on that.
Yeah, I think you just have to be able to put it together. When I was reading up on the Ferrari seasons, and no slouch, Ferrari had a season in 2002 where Michael didn't stand off the podium. 100% of the races he was on the podium, and that was just 2 years prior to this. So Ferrari had a dominant stretch of 4 years where they were untouchable. Now they didn't put it all together in one season the way Red Bull or McLaren did, and credit to Mercedes as well. We've seen Lewis have a couple lapses in his chokehold on the grid, a couple races here and there where he just doesn't have it. Maybe the championship's already locked up. He's out partying, and he's admitted that was maybe one of the slow starts to the 2016 season. But if you look at Max, man, that guy is just dialed in right now, kind of like Michael was, and it's going to be tough to beat.
Yeah, we say he's part robot, right?
Maybe fully.
He might be fully robot.
The world may never know.
Yeah, just to answer your question real quick, I think the way I think the season will go, the Ferrari will probably finish first, and that's a little bit of that is hope. I hope the Ferrari finishes, or the not the Ferrari, the Red Bull finishes first. You kind of want to see after you've seen 14 race wins, you just go ahead and win them all. Like let's see you do it. Let's see you run the table. I think they'll probably finish second just because they, like you said, other teams could bring some upgrade packages. They might be looking to next year. And I think Red Bull is thinking more long-term dominance rather than winning everything this one season. I don't think that's on their whiteboard of goals. So
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point, right? You've got next year to contend with, and with how restrictive the cost cap is, you want to kind of front load some of that development into this season. That way you have to spend fewer of your dollars and tokens on next year, right?
exactly. Well, listeners, if you have differing opinions or if you have the same opinions, just let us know in the poll that we'll be posting down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and maybe even other cars that you think should be in the discussion. But yeah, that's pretty much it from us.
Thank you for listening. And as always, go Bromula 1.
Yeah.
Woo-hoo.
Go Steven, we were so happy to have you, man. We missed you.
Yeah, buddy, we missed you.
I missed you guys. Thanks.